Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. While stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 286, and it's titled, When the Puritans Were in Power, written by H.M. Tichenor. Now, H.M. Tichenor, I like to do a little discovery or explanation on who the author was. And thanks to Wikipedia and ChatGPT, Henry Mulford Tichenor was a prominent American journalist, socialist, atheist, and advocate for free thought during the Progressive Era and the Golden Age of free thought. He was deeply involved in the socialist and free-thinking movements and served as a magazine editor as well as an author of numerous pamphlets and books. He authored influential works, often published in the Little Blue Books, a widely distributed series. His writings range from critiques of religion and capitalism to reinterpretations of myths and beliefs. Some of his notable titles include Sorceries and Scandals of Satan, Primitive Beliefs, Women Under Capitalism, and Rip Saw Mother Goose. That is H.M. Tichenor, the gentleman who wrote Little Blue Book number 286, titled When the Puritans Were in Power. And let's get started. This Little Blue Book was copyright 1921. So, a year prior to Mr. Tichenor's death. He died in 1922. Yep. Born 1858, died 1922. So this was written a year prior to his death, and this Little Blue Book is 104 years old. And it's showing its age. There's page 1. Okay, so here we go. Let me get a drink quick. Hydrate. All hydration breaks are brought to you by my friend Maddie. All right, here we go. When the Puritans Were in Power, by Henry M. Tichenor. There never were more fervent believers in the Bible than the Puritans, and they practiced what they believed. They followed Jehovah's every command. They made a holy covenant, which read, "We covenant with the Lord, and one with another, and do bind ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself to us, in his blessed word of truth." In order to strictly follow the blessed word of truth, the Puritans selected ordained lunatics to fill their pulpits, and these, in turn, decided who should be officials and legislators, judges and juries, justices of the peace and constables, jailers and hangmen. In Massachusetts, no man could be governor unless he was a professing Christian, worth at least $5,000, and the Puritan preachers dictated the kind of Christianity he should profess. The witch-hanging governors, Endicott and Winthrop, were noted examples of believing officials. They believed, turning the page, we shall see. Oh, come on now. They just don't want to separate. There we are. I know there's 2. Come on now. There we go. The word of truth from cover to cover, and followed it. Endicott and Winthrop had both signed death warrants for persons convicted of the crime witchcraft, or at least had not stayed the executions of the condemned. Winfield S. Nevin's Witchcraft in Salem Village. We read of the history of the period between the settlement of Salem by Roger Compton in 1626 and the witchcraft days of 1692. The intolerance of the Puritans had been strikingly manifested on more than one occasion. The Browns had been sent back to England for differing from Endicott and the First Church people. Endicott had cut the red cross from the flag because it reminded him of popery. Roger Williams had been banished from the colony for preaching that men should be allowed freedom of conscience in religious matters. Quakers had been hung in Boston, and Quaker women, half naked, dragged through the streets of Salem at the tail of a cart and whipped for maintaining the doctrines of this sect. All this by a people who, within a half century, had come to these shores to worship according to the dictates of conscience. So also Thomas Scrugg, a deputy and a judge of the local court, for sympathy with Anne Hutchinson's antinomian views, was proscribed, disarmed, and deprived of his public functions. William Alford, for sympathizing with Scrugg, was censured and disarmed and left the colony. Richard Waterman, an intelligent, industrious man and law-abiding citizen, for dissenting from the severe policy of the leading men of the colony, was imprisoned and banished. Even Townsend Bishop, in 1645, because he did not promptly bring forward an infant for baptism, was handed over for discipline, and he a deputy and local magistrate. Lady Deborah Moody, because she doubted the necessity of infant baptism, was compelled to leave the colony. Even in a much later day, William Gray was persecuted in Salem for opinion's sake and driven from the city. Nor has the spirit of intolerance and tyranny ever entirely left us. Espionage acts, sumptuary laws, censorship, and the outlawing of free speech disclose that this spirit is not as yet dead. The following description is given of the whippings of Quakers. Peter Pearson and Judith Brown, being stripped to the waist, were fastened to a cart tail and whipped through the town of Boston. Joseph Southwick, who also was stripped and led through the streets of Boston at the cart tail, and vehemently scourged by the hangman. The same day he was whipped in Roxbury, and the next morning in Dedham. The whip used for these executions was not of whipcord, but of dried guts, and each string had 3 knots at the end. At Dover, Anne Coleman, Mary Tompkins, and Alice Ambrose were sentenced to be fastened to the cart tail and whipped on their naked backs through 11 towns, a distance of nearly 80 miles. Then, on a very cold day, the deputy, Walden at Dover, caused these women to be stripped naked from the middle upward and tied to a cart, and then whipped them, while the preacher looked on and laughed at it. 2 of their friends testified against Walden's cruelty, for which they were put in stocks. The women were carried to Hampton, and there whipped, and from thence to Salisbury, and again whipped. William Barefoot at length obtained the warrant from the constable for their release, the preacher, however, protesting. Not long after, these women returned to Dover and were again seized while in meeting, and barbarously dragged out at the instigation of Hate Evil Nutwell, a ruling elder, and his name is Hate Evil, Hateevil. That's his first name, Nutwell. Should be reversed to Nutwell Hate Evil. Anyhow, they were dragged by their arms nearly a mile through the deep snow, across fields and over stumps, by which they were much bruised. The next day they were dragged down a steep hill to the water side and threatened with drowning, and one of them was actually plunged into the water, when a sudden shower obliged the Christians to retreat. At length, after much abuse, these victims of orthodox barbarity were turned out of doors at midnight, and, with their clothes wet and frozen, were obliged to suffer the inclemency of a severe winter's night. Afterward, Anne Coleman and 4 of her friends were whipped through Salem, Boston, and Dedham by order of Hawthorne, the magistrate. Anne Coleman was a little, weakly woman, and while she was fastened to the cart at Denham, the executioner, encouraged by the Puritan preacher Bellingham, struck her so savagely that, with the knot of the whip, he split the nipple of her breast, which so tortured her that it almost took away her life. From MacDonald's History of the Inquisition, quoted from Champions of the Church. These were but instances of the whippings and other outrages perpetrated by the Puritans upon Quakers, and those differing with Puritan doctrines. Margaret Brewster was the last Quaker woman of whom we have any record who was publicly whipped. She had gone to New England to make protest against this inhumane practice. She was seized, tried, and condemned for teaching contrary to the Bible, her sentence being in the following words: Margaret Brewster, you are to have your clothes stripped off to the middle, and to be tied to a cart's tail at the South Meeting House, and to be drawn through the town, and to receive 20 stripes upon your naked body. In the eyes of the Puritans, she was fortunate in not receiving the extreme biblical penalty for heresy as laid down in Deuteronomy, and stoned to death. In The Emancipation of Massachusetts by Brooks Adams, we read, viewed from the standpoint of comparative history, the policy of theocratic Massachusetts towards the Quakers was the necessary consequence of antecedent causes, and is exactly parallel with the massacre of the house of Ahab by Elijah and Jehu, as told in 2 Kings. The power of a dominant priesthood demanded on conformity, and the Quakers absolutely refused to conform. It may be noted here that the power of a dominant president also depends on conformity, and that men and women have been sent to prison who refuse to conform. To continue from the history quoted, nor was this the blackest of their crimes. They, the Quakers, believed that the deity communicated directly with men, and that these revelations were the highest rulers of conduct. Manifestly, such a doctrine was revolutionary. The influence of all ecclesiastics must ultimately rest upon the popular belief that they are endowed with attributes which are denied to common men. The syllogism of the New Englanders was this: all revelation was contained in the Bible. We alone, from our peculiar education, are capable of interpreting the meaning of the Scriptures. Therefore, we only can declare the will of God. But it is evident that where the dogma of the Quakers, of the inner light, once accepted, this reasoning must fall to the ground, and the authority of the ministry be overthrown. Necessarily, those who held so subversive a doctrine would be pursued with greater hate than less harmful heretics. And thus, contemplating the situation, there is no difficulty in understanding why the Reverend John pages are all falling apart. Why the Reverend John Wilson, pastor, Boston, should have vocified, Vocifered, vocifered, in his pulpit that he would carry fire in one hand and faggots in the other. I'm not sure what the definition of a faggot is for 1921. To burn all the Quakers in the world. That's kind of rude. Why the Reverend John Higginson should have denounced the inner light as a stinking vapor from hell. Why the astute Norton should have taught that the justice of God was the devil's armor. And why Endicott sternly warned the first comers, take heed you break not our ecclesiastical laws, for then ye are sure to stretch by the halter. Bancroft, in his History of the United States, gives the following description of the Puritans. New England, like Canaan, had been settled by fugitives. Like the Jews, they had fled to the wilderness. Like the Jews, they looked to heaven for light to lead them on. Like the Jews, they had no supreme ruler but God. Like the Jews, they had heathen for their foes, and they derived their legislation from the Jewish code. But for the people of New England, the days of Moses and Joshua were past. For them, there was no longer a promised land. They were in possession. Reason now insisted on bringing the adopted laws to the proof that it might hold fast only to the good. Skepticism began to appear. The fear of sorcery and the evil power of the invisible world had sprung alike from the letter of the Mosaic law and from the wonder excited by the mysteries of nature. The belief in witchcraft had fastened itself on the elements of faith and became deeply branded into the common mind. In the settlement of New England, the temple, or as it was called, the meeting house, was the center around which the people gathered, as the church had successfully assumed the exclusive possession of civil franchises. The ambition of the ministers had been both excited and gratified. They were not only the counselors by an unwritten law, they were the authors of the state papers, often employed on embassies, and at home, speakers at elections and in town meetings. So absolutely was New England under the domination of the theologians that an Indian chief, Cotton Mather, denounced the Indians as an offspring of Satan, remarked, "What a God have the English, who deal so with one another about their God." In the year 1657, Anne Burden and Mary Dyer were imprisoned at Boston, and Mary Clark, for warning these persecutors of deists from their iniquity, was unmercifully rewarded with 20 stripes of a three-corded whip, and on her naked back, and detained in prison about 3 months in the winter season. The cords of these whips were commonly as thick as a man's little finger, each cord having knots at the end. Christopher Holder and John Copeland were whipped at Boston the same year, each 30 stripes with a knotted whip of 3 cords, the hangman measuring his ground and fetching the strokes with all the force he could, which so cruelly cut their flesh that a woman standing by fell down dead. Then they were locked up in prison and kept 3 days without food, or so much as a drink of water, and detained in prison 9 weeks in the cold winter season, without fire, bed, or straw. They afterwards had their right ears cut off by authority. Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick, and their son Josiah, being carried to Boston, were all of them, notwithstanding the old age of the two, sent to the house of correction, and whipped with cords as those before in the coldest season of the year. From MacDonald's History of the Inquisition, quoted from the Champions of the Church. Nor were the puritanical laws confined to New England. They existed under the domination of the Episcopal Church, as well as under Calvinism. To a more or less extent, they exist in this country today. Still do. And if religious bigots and political despots can have their way, they will increase. And they are. Thomas Jefferson, in his Notes on Virginia, writes, "The first settlers of Virginia were immigrants from England, of the English Church, just at a point of time when it was flushed with complete victory over the religions of all other persuasions. Possessed as they became of the powers of making, administering, and executing the laws, they showed equal intolerance in this country with their Presbyterian brethren who had immigrated to the Northern government. Several acts of the Virginia Assembly of 1659, 1662, and 1693 had made it penal in parents to refuse to have their children baptized, had prohibited the unlawful assembling of Quakers, had made it penal for any pardon me for any master of a vessel to bring a Quaker into the state, and ordered those already there, and such as should come thereafter, to be imprisoned till they should abjure the country. Provided a milder penalty for the first and second return, but death for the third. If no capital execution took place here, as did in New England, It was not owing to the moderation of the church or spirit of the legislature, as may be inferred from the law itself, but to historical circumstances, which have not been handed down to us. And that is the end of part 1 and chapter 1 of When the Puritans Were in Power, written by H.M. Titchener. Little Blue Book, number 286. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.